My name's Matt Larsen. I'm the director of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama. And I have to say I slipped out a little bit today and went to the march, and I wore my costume, which is a bureaucrat for science. There was only one guy with a tie at that march that I saw, so I rocked the costume. So I want to welcome you all, and if you did go to the march, you're nice and dry now, I hope. No. And, well, mostly dry. And we're in for a great set of talks here. We have 5 different speakers. They're going to be talking about incomes from nature, something that we also refer to as ecosystem services, benefits from nature, and something I'm particularly enamored with, something we work on a lot in Panama where I work and live. And one of the stories I like to tell is one of the benefits, of course, that we all know about is biodiversity. And I like to quote everyone's favorite Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who we may have not have liked his policies, but he coined some great phrases. And one of them that scientists love was when he spoke about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. And he was talking about the invasion of Iraq. But when you think about science and biodiversity, there's a lot we don't know about biodiversity. And one of the reasons, if I get into a discussion with a member of Congress or somebody about why is it important, I try to give concrete examples, but at the end of it, if nothing wins them over, I say, look, we really don't know what's out there. And it's important to protect everything because some of that may be to our benefit. And I tell the story about since 1980, 50% of all licensed medicines that we use nowadays come from natural substances, plant and animal, in the environment. So we don't know what we might lose if we lose a sloth or if we lose some other species in a forest or in a coral reef. So biodiversity is one of the really valuable ecosystem services and incomes and benefits from nature. There's many, many others, and you'll learn about some of them today. And so without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Jim Miller, who's with the Missouri Botanical Garden in the great city of St. Louis. Everyone's got 12 minutes. We're going to try to keep on track, unlike some of the other sessions today. And that should allow us maybe time for 1-2 questions in between, and then at the end, a little more time to follow up. So without any further words from me, Jim Miller. The left, the right.
Yeah. So thanks. And I really want to thank the organizers of this Earth Optimism Summit, which has really been very inspiring, and it's been a wonderful event, and I'm glad to be a part of it. Wow, happy Earth Day. I also went out on the mall today, and my feet are still soaking wet. And I really want to express my admiration for all the people who showed up to support science and environmentalism. The people who got soaking wet doing it here, but also the millions of people who came out in cities all around the world, not just in the United States. It's really an amazing outpouring, and it's bigger than just a protest against this current administration. It's really the greatest outreach I've ever seen to interest young people in science and just encourage people to listen to science in general. And my highlight of the afternoon was seeing a young girl who had a sign that said, "Rising oceans, Mar-a-la gone." It was very good. So I'm going to, in the spirit of this conference, I'm going to give you a highly speculative talk and talk more about the future than about the past. And what I want to do is talk about what we just heard a mention of is how important plants have been as sources of medicines and how potentially important they could continue to be in the future, which is one of the sort of most capitalist reasons for conserving them. Historically, plants have always been one of our major sources of therapeutic treatments for health conditions. And if we do a little bit of math, we can actually make some pretty interesting speculations about how many drugs may remain undiscovered in nature. So the first data point that you need to know is you need to have some sort of an estimate of how many of our drugs come from nature. Well, the most conservative one is that Norman Farnsworth, the great pharmacognostist from the University of Illinois, identified 119 drugs as coming from natural sources in 1990. And since that time, there have been, about a dozen and a half more licensed from plants. Now, this is the most conservative look that you could take, because these are all compounds that either exist as we use them as medicines in plants, or they're synthetically produced copies of plants. This does not include drugs that are developed because we found an interesting bioactive and we started tinkering with its chemical structure and we ended up with a useful pharmaceutical. Like many of our common anti-malarial drugs now, they look like quinine, but they're chemically different. So they're not in this figure. I'm going to use 135 as the number of drugs that have come from plants. The second piece of information we need is we need an estimate of how many species of plants there are. And in 1973, the great evolutionary biologist Ledyard Stebbins tried to count them all, and he came up with a figure just a little over 230,000. And since that time, there have been numerous papers published speculating about how many species of plants there are. And those numbers range all the way from the low 300,000s to almost 500,000. But how many really are out there? There's more than one component to the question. First of all, there is the question of how many plant species do we already know? And a lot of the papers that have been published and account for the wide range of variation have been trying to accommodate or deal with the fact that we botanists are very good at redundantly naming things. So there are certainly a lot more names. There's about 1.2 million published names for plants, and there clearly are nowhere near that many plant species. So there have been many estimates to try to figure out what percentage of those names really are synonyms, and then do math to figure out how many plant species we accept. I actually think that Stebbins' approach gives you a more accurate answer. And if you do that and you ask and you use something like David Mabberley's plant book and you go through and add up the numbers that were provided by specialists for each known family of vascular plants, you get a number that's very close to 300,000. And so I'm going to use that as the number of plants that are known. This is Catharanthus micaensis. It's an interesting member of a genus. One of its congeners gives us vincristine, a chemical that's used to treat childhood leukemia. This is a species that one of our scientists at the garden described as new to science last year. There's also the question of how many plants are out there that remain to be named, the Donald Rumsfeld unknown unknowns. And that is a much more difficult problem to grapple with. The one thing that we can quantify is that the botanical research community as a whole publishes on average about 2,000 new species of plants every year and has continued to do so for the last 40 or 50 years, and that number goes up and down a few hundred each year, but it doesn't fluctuate much and the average stays about the same. We don't see any asymptote coming. And when I talk to most of my colleagues who are systematists, most of them have cabinets full of stuff that they're waiting to describe. I think the 2,000 may be more a measure of how much available journal space there is rather than how many plants actually remain to be described. But I'm going to assume that over the next 50 years, botanists will describe another 100,000 species. The last thing that we need to know, if there's 300,000 known species and 100,000 unknown, so we have 400,000 total. The hardest number to figure out is what percentage of the plant world was studied to find the 135 known plant-derived medicines. And the literature is full of estimates that say everything from we've studied 2% of the world's plants or we've only studied 15% of the world's plants. But when you look at those, you quickly realize that those are very misleading numbers because you don't need to understand this list. What you need to realize is that each one of the things in this list is a therapeutic category. It's not a disease. So Cancer is in that list once, although the United States National Cancer Institute recognizes more than 300 different kinds of cancers. Bacterial diseases are in that list once. The bottom line is some plants have been evaluated against a few, usually a small number of therapeutic targets. I think there's very few plants that we can cross off the list as of no utility for anything. Certainly we can cross off our major food plants, something like corn that's been picked apart one molecule at a time. I don't think anybody thinks they're undiscovered drugs in our major starch crops. But another element of this is that in the way that the plants that have historically been evaluated, even in the 1960s, Matt Sustenance, who ran the Natural Products Discovery Program at the National Cancer Institute at the time, pointed out that the way we screen and evaluate plants, you're only likely to find those active compounds that are present at highest concentration in the plant. People have been studying crude extracts that are mixtures of 400 to 700 chemicals, and you've got to either be extremely potent or extremely abundant to be able to be discovered with that kind of a discovery mentality. So what have we learned? Well, we've learned that there probably are a lot more plants out there than we've historically thought, and we've learned that we probably have not evaluated very many of them thoroughly. We haven't studied them well at all. And we probably haven't even done a good job evaluating the ones that we have evaluated. I'm absolutely certain that of the discovery programs that I've been involved with, that there have been many plants that went through batteries of bioassays that had use, and those samples had useful compounds in them that were not discovered. So knowing these figures, or having an upper and a lower bound for these figures, we can do some calculations. So we're assuming that there's 135 known plant-derived drugs, that there's 300,000 to 400,000 plant species out there, and depending upon what kind of assumptions you make and where you fall on the spectrum, I'm going to say that somewhere between 5,000 and 50,000 plants have been evaluated. So from that, it's pretty easy to just plug those into a formula and come up with an estimated number of potential drugs that remain in nature to be discovered. And so if you have 300,000 and 400,000, and then you look at what happens if you screen 5,000 to 50,000, these are the, whoa, that's not what I expected. These are the numbers of predicted drugs that are out there in nature to be discovered. The low end of the spectrum being that you assume you've screened a lot, and you assume that we're only going to count the species that we already know. And the high end here being that you assume that there are still 100,000 species out there that we haven't found yet, and that we really haven't screened very many at all. The bottom line is all of these numbers dwarf the 135 that are in our current pharmacopoeia. So even the most current estimates, even the most conservative estimates, show that we really haven't found most of what is probably already out there. So in conclusion, I think we can say that there are probably a myriad of pharmacologically useful compounds that remain in nature, that remain undiscovered, but they're probably very unevenly distributed, and we're going to have to look for them differently than we've historically looked for them in the past. I think probably lots more plants have made it into discovery laboratories, and they actually had useful compounds in them, and they weren't discovered. So I think this is one of the great arguments for conserving plants. These intact forests are, in fact, reservoirs of pharmaceutically useful compounds, and we've barely scratched the surface. Thanks.
One or two questions for Jim, if they're brief. Use the mic, please, because we're video streaming all this, and it's going all over the world.
Well, that's a scary thought. So I have a question about that is, so you're saying there's all these plants that may have these like bioactive compounds and things. But usually when you do drug discovery, you find a symptom or a problem, and then you try to solve it from there. So I don't really understand. Like, you're saying that in vivo screens are taking too long, or too tedious to go through, and like for example, if you're doing an antiviral drug, you're gonna do like a high throughput screen with like robots and thousands of samples a day. And I'm just wondering how, like, what's the are you looking for biologically active compounds and then trying to find a use for them, or is it the other way around?
No, all of the discovery programs that I'm talking about. There are multiple approaches to finding new therapeutic compounds, but one of them is screening, and screening is driven by bioassays that are target specific. So we don't isolate a compound and then ask what it might be used for. We find it because it was active in an antiviral assay. And almost all of those assays these days are robot-driven, and they're very high throughput.
Thank you.
Great. We'll take the rest of the questions at the end. We are going to try to stay on track and then have enough time at the end so there's time for more questions for any of the speakers, and we still get to the reception timely. So I'd like to next introduce Laure Katz, who is the Director of Connected Oceans Program at Conservation International. And we're delighted to have you here.
Thank you. All right, well, happy Earth Day, everybody. So I have to admit, when I was first invited to speak here, I was a little bit more nervous than I normally am to speak. Optimism about our Earth is in short supply right now, and I wasn't completely convinced that I would be able to muster enough. As I was preparing, headlines were going across my newsfeed. The Great Barrier Reef reaches its terminal stage. Coral reefs are in more trouble than we thought. When I tell people that I am a marine biologist who works to save coral reefs and other special ocean places around the world, I typically get one of two responses. Cool. Or, but isn't it a lost cause? And I have to admit, sometimes I struggle with the same doubt. And yet, each day, I get up and I go to work. Why? Because somehow I still have hope. In the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, hope is the belief that if we work hard enough, we can make things better. And it needs a great deal of courage to have hope. And so today, I wanted to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about courage, one that gives me hope. The story takes place in one of our last wild treasures, the Bird's Head Seascape in West Papua, Indonesia. As a marine ecologist and someone who has had the pleasure of working there for the last 9 years and living there for 4, I can tell you without a doubt that there is no other place like it on Earth. With more fish and coral species there, the Bird's Head Seascape is the very epicenter of marine biodiversity on the planet. Being underwater there is nothing short of electrifying. I could happily entertain you until cocktail hour with beautiful photos from the seascape or tales of happy encounters with its majestic inhabitants, but I won't. Instead, I want to tell you the story of thousands of people, most of which are Indigenous Papuans, who have worked together with Conservation International and a coalition of over 30 conservation partners for the last 12 years to transform this place from a playground for poachers to one of the healthiest and most productive marine environments on the planet. I'm going to tell you their story through the story of one, my teammate and my friend, Chris Tebu. Papua is Chris's home. He's an indigenous leader from the Maya tribe, the first inhabitants of an area called Raja Ampat. For centuries, Chris's ancestors lived off of the abundance that Papua provided. And generation after generation, they passed down traditional knowledge and a traditional system of natural resource management called SASI that ensured that each generation was left with enough. Despite this rich traditional knowledge, they were wholly unprepared in the 1990s when there was an influx of poachers from other areas of Indonesia and Asia who, having already destroyed their own reefs, were attracted to Papua's seemingly endless resources. These poachers brought with them fish bombs, long lines, and cyanide. They completely ignored traditional ownership of these reefs, and they hammered them. Many of Chris's generation, deeply frustrated with what they were seeing and lack of options, ultimately picked up the same practices. Very quickly, the limits of Papua's resources were found. As fish populations plummeted, indigenous Papuans, 75% of which rely on fish as their primary source of protein, were left hungry. Over half are considered to be food insecure, with 13% experiencing involuntary reoccurring hunger. Most of these were women and children. It was from this context that the Bird's Head Seascape Initiative was born. In 2004, Conservation International formed a coalition of partners, including the Nature Conservancy and WWF, dedicated to working together with local Papuan communities and local governments to protect this reservoir of marine biodiversity. The goal was to protect marine biodiversity while simultaneously enhancing food security, local livelihoods, and protecting Papuans' traditional ways of life. But in a land with no conservation capacity and barely formed governments, how does one begin? Many conservation programs would have brought in experts from other parts of Indonesia to fill the capacity gap. We hired Chris. Chris was a respected leader from his community, but like most in his community, didn't have access to education past 8th grade. He had never studied biology, and he had never used a computer. And yet somehow Chris knew intuitively that his future and the future of his children was inextricably linked to the health of Papua. And so we invested in Chris with training and mentorship for years for Chris and a whole cohort of Papuan leaders like him, with the goal that they, not us, could ultimately lead the seascape into the future. Chris struggled. He struggled to learn Excel, basic grammar, report writing, things that I would imagine some of us in this room still struggle with ourselves. But he brought a different kind of brilliance. Chris could absorb conservation theory and science and creatively apply it in ways that would inspire his community. As fish biologists, we know that larger female fish can produce exponentially more eggs than their petite counterparts. So for example, a 3-foot fish can produce 20 times more eggs than 1/2 her size. Chris took that science and wove it into a Papuan-style story about big mamas that ended up becoming part of the local fishing lore and helped convince local fishermen that they should set aside large areas of the ocean for their fish to grow big. When we were struggling with reconciling conservation goals and traditional ownership, Chris helped map out traditional ownership rights and tenure across every village and taught us about the tradition of SASI so that we could incorporate it in. That way, the Marine Protected Area network that we were creating could reinforce, not contradict, traditional ownership rights. And in this way, we help to motivate local Papuan communities through a bottom-up process to declare the largest marine protected area network and no-take zones in all of Southeast Asia. And when those zones and protected areas were threatened by poachers, Chris devised a rotating patrol system in which local tenure holders and community members would participate on a rolling basis in the enforcement and management of their protected areas. In this way, every single community member had an active role in protecting their ecosystems. And while they were on duty, Chris and his deputies would deliver conservation trainings to all of them. I helped train Chris, but Chris trained thousands. Chris's community patrols bravely went after poachers, sometimes in boats much larger and even with bombs. And yet, they were successful, reducing poaching by outsiders by over 90%. And thanks to those big mamas, the fish are coming back. In some of the protected areas, we're seeing biomass rebounding almost over double, and in some of the no-take zones, quadrupling of fish biomass. Local fishers are catching 2.5 times the amount of fish with the same level of effort. And just last month, I dove on a reef surrounded by a dozen reef sharks, a place that 10 years ago, it would have been hard to see one. These ecological results, stable and positive trends for fish and coral, offer a bit of a ray of hope, even with rising temperatures, in contrast to global trends of decline. And what about for the people? Tourism is growing rapidly, with 20 to 30% increases in annual arrivals every year, and is now the foundation of the local economy. Locally owned, Papuan-owned homestays alone brought in $1 million into local families last year. And perhaps most importantly, we now have documented that the marine protected areas are driving significant increases in food security and in educational enrollment across the seascape. Chris is now the lead technical advisor for the entire Bird's Head Seascape Marine Protected Area Network. And for perspective, the seascape is roughly the size of Great Britain. So this is a pretty large area that he's now managing. The teams that he helped to create have been embedded in a new co-management structure with the local government, allowing them to have stable employment and government funding. Through the work of the Bird's Head Seascape Coalition and Chris and people like him, the communities of West Papua are on the brink of securing a sustainable future. But we are not done yet. Now we are working to ensure that our impact is enduring. To that end, we've launched the Blue Abadi Initiative, an initiative to ensure the financial sustainability of the seascape long-term. As with the seascape itself, reaching sustainability has required both local and global contributions. Over 70% of the revenue needed to protect this place has been secured through Indonesian revenue sources. The government has quadrupled its contribution to marine protected areas as it saw tangible results for its constituents. And tourism user fees now bring in over $1 million directly for conservation each year. Our global community has also chipped in. 2 months ago, we launched the Blue Abadi Fund with initial commitments of $23 million, making it on track to be the world's largest dedicated marine conservation trust fund ever. The name we chose, Abadi, means forever in Bahasa Indonesia, and it is through Blue Abadi that we will ensure that Chris and the teams that he helped create have the financial resources that they need to protect the Bird's Head Seascape, the single greatest reservoir of marine species on the planet, and to protect it forever, for their benefit and for ours. So while my story is done, our work is not. New challenges emerge daily. whether in the form of new political climates, rising temperatures, or tourism now growing so fast that it threatens to love the place to death. The bird's head, and in fact the entire Earth that we celebrate today, needs all of us. From local indigenous communities to governments to scientists to conservationists to explorers to inventors to investors. We must all take action, and we must form those coalitions that can work together to bring real change. If we do, then I think there's still hope. Thank you, and terima kasih.
Thank you, Laure. We have time for one question. Anyone succinct? Go ahead.
So I think this is an incredible success story of how you can bring global knowledge, and when you adapt it locally, it really seems to be working. So I was wondering if you have, what's your approach on how to merge these localized initiatives with international treaties that could be enforced more, larger scale? What's the best way to approach that? Because I feel like a lot of international cooperation is failing because there isn't enough local knowledge, because there aren't enough resources, I guess not enough agencies like yours that would go to those places and actually work with local people. So what do you think is the best way to scale up to make this happen in more places?
That is a phenomenal and difficult question. Thank you for that. So for me, I think the way you started to frame it was bringing kind of global knowledge local, and certainly there was an aspect of that. But I think the more powerful piece of it is capturing local knowledge, understanding it, creatively combining it with global knowledge, and figuring out a way to make it work on the ground. That's going to be different in every place, but the acknowledgement of and respect for that knowledge, that it is science, it is tradition, it is as powerful as a lot of the work that we do kind of on the global stage, and making sure that that type of knowledge is embedded in and respected in our international treaties, in our international conversations, that it's not just, and I'm a scientist and I love science, but it's not just scientists speaking to scientists or policymakers speaking to policymakers, but we have indigenous wisdom and local wisdom part of that conversation, because I think that's where you're going to get the most powerful solutions coming out.
Thanks, Laure.
Yep.
Great. So now we're going to hear from Octavio Aburto, who is an assistant professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography and a professional photographer associate with the International League of Conservation Photographers. So welcome, Octavio.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I think to talk about income from nature, we need to talk about communities. I think they are doing by themselves a very good job. And I think we need to learn a lot from them. And let me go directly to this picture, because this picture I took it in a community with the help of my friend David Castro, that is in front of this huge group of fish. And this community, the name is Cabo Pumo, it's in Baja California. And after working there for almost 15 years, it took me 3 years to take that picture. To have the right conditions, because I want to capture this moment that basically explain these three things, or for me, I think, explain these three things. How Cabo Pumo community is preserving the circle of life, how they have become stewards of nature, and when these two things happen at the same time, you can see great economic benefits or economic impacts. So let me start with what is happening with the fish. The fish, they are in the reproduction season. They do a very elaborated courtship behaviors. They gather in a huge numbers, huge, 4,000, 5,000 fish. They only have one objective, that is to mate. And you can see that they form this river of fish in the surface, and then some days before the full moon, all the fish go down, and then you can see the river flowing on the bottom of the sandy areas. And one day before the full moon, they start forming these big fish balls. It's probably 15 meters high, this ball, and then suddenly start gyrating, and you can see that some pairs of fish come out from the ball. The black one is the male. The silver one is the female. And just during the sunset of the full moon, you can see all the pairs forming again. Males as the shadow of the females, and all together they spawn. So you can see that this is a circle of life. There are the spawning aggregations, then the larvae grow or born in the open water. They, in some way, they find the coastal habitat like mangroves, kelp forests, seagrasses, and they spend sometimes as a nursery habitat there, and then go back to the offshore where they found or find the shallow reefs and the deep reefs. So what humans do? Well, we fish these aggregations, and we target these aggregations, we target these sites, and in a very, very few minutes, we can extract all the fish that I show you in the picture at the beginning of my presentation, and all the eggs. Most of the time, they finish in the landfill, and basically we waste all the energy that the fish produce produce to have these new generations. And what we have been doing with the coastal habitats, like mangroves, well, we are destroying them in the same way, even that they embrace and protect many of these juvenile fishes that basically are juveniles of commercial species that later we fish as an adult. So I don't want to bore you with scientific results, but we have the data, we have the evidence that show that when there is more mangroves, there are more fisheries landings, and also there is more money for the community. So we have this evidence, and not only for the coastal habitats, also for the spawning aggregation. So this is very, very important. So let me come back to the picture, and now let me tell you about David's story. Is the human side of this picture. He belongs to this family, the Castro family, and his dad and his uncles, they decided 20 years ago to close the area, to don't fish in that area. And again, I don't want to bother you with all this scientific data, but you can see here how we have measured the change in Cabo Pumo in these last 20 years. And basically, if I take you right now to dive in Cabo Pumo, what you will see are pictures like these, amazing groups of grunts, snappers, groupers that can reach 2.5 meters in length. Some of these reefs are very, very productive: sardines, surgeon fishes, even parrotfishes that are very, very big, and they are the ones that are in charge of cleaning the rocks and open space for corals and other animals. So you can see that the reefs are in a very healthy state. Groupers, carnivores like moray eels, they hunt together in a way that probably hasn't been described in such these numbers. And for me, Cabo Pumo is like going back in time, and maybe this is the reason why or what Jacques Cousteau saw in the Sea of Cortez and named it the aquarium of the world. And now these guys are coming back. This is a bull shark that we know that born close or inside Cabo Pumo, but we have seen tiger sharks, white-tip reef sharks, silky sharks, like 11 species of sharks. Every year they are coming more and more often, and this is what we need, especially to maintain the productivity of the reef. So after all these sacrifices done by the community, now it's very famous everywhere. everywhere. Everyone wants to come there and dive. But these guys are very, very smart. Why? Because they go out, they take sport fishermen, they go out and they fish tuna, wahoo, and they bring other people to dive inside the park. And they don't fish inside the park. So they can show them all the magnificent life that you can see inside the park. And now there are more and more people paying a lot of money to dive, for example, with sharks that, as you may know, they are overfished in many parts of the planet. And this is the group of yaks that I showed you at the beginning of my presentation. And they also take snorkelers to see this group, amazing group of yaks, and the income that they generate right now overpass the average income per capita in Mexico. So let me finish with these ideas. I love the guys or the community from Cabo Pumo, but I think there are other communities in Mexico and also in other places, as we have seen during these days in this summit, that they are fighting to have better or healthier environments. And I have been traveling trying to document these things. For example, this is Yelapa. It's very close to Puerto Vallarta. And what they are trying to do is to save these big manta rays. The community there, they have changed their fishing gears. And basically what they want to achieve is to increase the manta population in order to bring tourists and have the encounters with this animal and basically increase the economic benefits that they can produce with these interactions. Or this is Humberto and his uncle Abel, that they live in a very spectacular mangrove area in Chiapas. And what they have been doing is they go and find the nest of this species, the American crocodile, get the juvenile just when they hatch from the eggs. And they take care of them for 1 or 2 months and then release them back to the lagoon. So they have been doing this for 20 years. And now the population of one of the top predators of mangroves and coastal lagoons, they have come back. And in that way, the lagoon is more productive. And now more and more birds you can see more and more birds in this lagoon. And this is generating more money for them. This is the guys from Boca de Camichín, and they are fighting to protect this. This is the San Pedro Mezquital River. It's the last river in Mexico that is flowing free. There is no dams in this river. And why they are trying to do that? Because they have this oyster farm in the mouth of the river. And they put the seeds of these oysters, the larvae, at the beginning of the rain season. Basically, the nutrients that come from the high mountains are brought by the river flow. And at the end of the rain season, basically, they harvest a huge amount of oysters without any investment. And finally, this is another one. This is fishermen from the southern part of Baja California, El Pardito. They are implementing these no-take areas that are called fisheries refuges, basically trying to protect some species, but in particular, they are very interested in protect these devil rays that during the day they do these acrobatic jumps out of the water, but at night they congregate in a very, very huge numbers. So there are tourists that now are paying to have one of these trips, and rather to overfish these resources with their nets, basically they are protecting these species to generate incomes for their communities. So everywhere I go, I think there are more and more people that are trying to protect the environment, and they want more healthier ecosystems. And we believe that these stories should be told, and that is the reason why we create this series, Voces del Mar, Voices from the Sea. Basically, it's a series of documentaries that are shared through social media, basically to share with everyone why it's important to protect the circle of life, why it's important that these communities have become stewards of the nature, and if these two things happen at the same time, basically the economic benefits that they are receiving are very, very high. So please find us at Mares Mexicanos because we are diving deeper into these stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. We're going to move on and save questions for Felipe towards the end. Spectacular. Perdóname, Felipe is next. Octavio. Spectacular photos. Reminds me of what we'd see if we went diving in the Potomac right here. Well, almost. So we're going to go further south in Central America, closer to my neighborhood in Panama. We're going to now go to Costa Rica, where we'll hear from Felipe Carazo, who is the executive director of FUNDECOR. And by the way, there's some brochures on the table outside. Are there still? Yes. From FUNDECOR if you want to find out more about it. But thank you, Felipe, for joining us.
I'm going to try to use this name. Okay, thank you, Matthew. And thanks for the opportunity of sharing a bit about our work in Costa Rica. That's a picture of Cerro Chirripó. That's the highest peak in Costa Rica, 3,820 meters. Here's my friend Javier. We've been around. The first time I climbed that peak, I was 1985. I was 10 years old. And it was my parents who decided, probably taking a bit of risk, you know, should we go and do that hike with that little kid? Back in that day, there was no park rangers. It's a national park, but there was no park rangers. There was no park installed capacity, an old refuge. But I went, and somehow I made it up there. And that experience generated an enormous connection with the mountains and with my country, with the nature that surrounded it. I think I was the beneficiary of a peace dividend that the country was able to convert into an investment in protected areas. That provided me that experience. And not only that, the generation that was able to do that in the 80s, in the 70s and in the 80s, was a generation that was able to do a turn on the way the country was developing. We had enormous high rates of deforestation. And that came about around the idea of putting together institutional capacity in the country that could consolidate the protected areas and that can start to see how we could keep trees in place and the biodiversity that's there. So the National Institute of Biodiversity was created, FUNDECOR, the organization elite, was created, and the Ministry of Environment was put into work, and that led to certain results that many of you might have heard, and if not, we can share here. You know, Costa Rica was able to turn its forest coverage from 23%, 25% in the early 80s to 52% in the last account. It's a country, being a small country, you know, having 4% of biodiversity of the world and 0.05% of the land, is an enormous asset for our development. That natural capital has become important within our energy matrix, specifically linked to electricity provision, because it has allowed us to put in place hydro and geothermal energy matrix that has set the tone for the way that models is developing and has reached volumes of almost 100% of renewable energy to source electricity in the country. So in a way, those are the foundations, like it or not, of a green economy scheme. But those results, you have to understand that create a series of enabling conditions for economic scheme of the country to bloom, basically around tourism. Tourism started to catch up in the 19th because of the protected areas and the way the communities around the protected areas would identify with nature as a result of those efforts. Tourism has grown to become the main source of income of Costa Rica. We receive, the ratio of citizens and tourists is 0.5. So for 2 citizens, we have like about one tourist a year. And it represents a 2 billion industry yearly, which is about 12% of our GDP, and 11% of the direct and indirect labor. So it's important. Of course, it brings other issues. It brings different schemes in terms of infrastructure and competitiveness. It has generated high cost for life. But again, that turning point took place because of what was done in the 80s. Now, behind all of this, there's a certain series of elements that we tend to ignore. There's like underlying conditions that can give more elements for further processes. The way this model, this approach of changing land use and creating economic benefits was done had an enormous impact through the people, through a bottom-up approach. FUNDECOR, institutional lead in the 90s, was a think tank and a do tank. How do we think? How do we go and rip the opportunities that the Rio Convention back in the day set up with climate change, and hey, let's sell oxygen. Sell oxygen became, let's fix carbon. That's when the joint implementation efforts took place. FUNDECOR started to pilot those things through regeneration, reforestation, working with local landowners and telling them, you know what, the forest you're bringing down, you're going to turn it around, and actually you're going to pay for a service for that. What? Yeah. How? You know, including transaction costs and making sure there was a benefit out of this. This knowledge was mainstream in national policy frameworks. Initially, we were aiming to have Kyoto as a means of funding these processes. Costa Rica did broker with all this information the first negotiation country to country, and probably the last one, because Kyoto never was able to galvanize. And the Norwegian government was able to pay for CTOs, carbon tradable offsets, back in the day. They don't exist anymore. But it was a significant process that allowed Costa Rica to put a system to have that implementation of incentives in private lands linked to the public lands that had been developed through the protected area system. Because the market never bloomed, then we had to go out and look for efforts. How? Let's go and look to our fuel consumption and put a tax into it. So that's part of our story. But behind that, there's those people. There's these local people in Costa Rica that were able to jump into that and basically live out of this process. It has generated a level of awareness that's very important. The country started to promote environmental education. And as a result, now we have 75% of the country is environmentally aware. That allows us to, in a way, protect environmental issues when we're dealing with politics and governments. And therefore, have institutions like FUNDECOR work in these cases such that government policies can become state policies over time. Elisinio, the person that you're seeing in this small video, is one of those cases. A person that went out and decided to jump into that proposal that the Costa Rican society was putting into place and protect his forest, receive a payment of environmental services, good enough just to pay the accounts. But he put 2 hectares into reforestation. One of the hectares has helped him pay the education of their daughters, and the other one, he wants to pay the education of his younger son. So that's the way things have evolved. However, it's not enough. Now, 25 years after, we need to make sure that in Costa Rica we don't fall into comfort zones because of what we've done, how we mainstream this in our development model. And we have a challenge, and that challenge is how you go beyond conservation into real, thorough development. Now, we have a very solid conservation agenda, and we have income linked to it. But now it's how do you go and you address a series of themes that we haven't addressed. We've been very good with the green agenda. Now we have to look at the brown agenda, the green agenda, the marine realm, and make this a real green economy case. So you have to build new value propositions. So my generation, who grew up with peace dividend, with the possibility of being in a country that exposes you to nature in a way that's normal, it's part of how we can move on and grow up and set our country's route, has a challenge now to go one step further and to build what we say the Costa Rica 2.0. And that's what we're trying to do, and we're trying to lead in FUNDECOR. We're trying to see how can really go deep into what's into the landscape approach. How do we go deep and connect the forest, the biodiversity, to the livelihoods, to the development with local governments? How do we create schemes down on the ground that promote climate resilience with low emission development? That's why we're trying to develop and prototype monitoring and reporting and verification schemes for adaptation. That's how we're trying to complement to our environmental services program transaction schemes for biodiversity. We're basically promoting and trying to see how we can get Costa Rica to be a breathing lab. It has enormous conditions that we can test ideas and models. We're trying to focus on the 30 meters. This is a photo of a drone flight done the day after the hurricane that hit us last year. Why is it important? Not because we just saw how the conditions are. No, it's because we were able to connect communities into getting information that allows us to know which are the more risk-prone areas. And therefore, we were able to orient, with this information, the local emergency committees to know where to deploy resources and have a very good prevention strategy in place. And this video was taken after the storm passed, just to show people in the community through technology, through streaming, that things were coming back to terms. We're starting to map, as I mentioned, to map where the prone areas are through open source data schemes, through phones in which people are starting to understand where do I have these conditions, through the application of technology. This breathing lab proposal has an orientation that goes beyond conservation. It aims to have Costa Rica reap the benefits of its investment over the last 30 years and be competitive worldwide. Why? Because as Switzerland is able to develop a market to transfer knowledge and financial advice, or Singapore in port logistics, how can Costa Rica be competitive in providing knowledge and environmental front? There's 54 countries now under the Paris Agreement that need solutions for the forest. It's not that you can, copy and paste things, but the way you go about it can be transferred and generate and knowledge applied in other processes. This is where now we're getting a lot of schemes in place. We have countries like Morocco sending information about their red proposals, packed, through GIS schemes and being analyzed by Costa Ricans, and we're helping them put a PS model back there, or implementing the PS legislation in Paraguay, or having Namibia interested in the institutional arrangements that we have. For this, we are putting together an international initiative, and this means the country of Costa Rica, called the Costa Rica Green Hub, trying to partner with Norway, who helped us 20 years ago, with China, who's promoting South-South cooperation, and identifying where are other countries in which enabling conditions have to be developed and how the South-South cooperation and knowledge sharing scheme can help. So this is a tale of a country that wants to go further up, of a generation that needs to push those conditions to happen, and of a country that sees things globally and wants to engage in the global economy through the investment we've done in nature, because we think this is a valid development model for our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe. You abolished your army in, was it 1948?
1949 it was abolished. 1948 was the Civil War.
Think what we could do if we abolished our army. Wow, that's a lot of funding. Well, without further on that fantasy, we're going to go further south. We're going to skip right over Panama, and we're going to go straight over to Guyana and hear from the Honorable Sidney Allicock, who is the Indigenous representative of the Iwokrama International Board of Trustees and the Minister of Indigenous Peoples Affairs of the Parliament of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, sir. Miyaadamangi Yamadama, are you still awake? I am so happy to be here today to, how do we do this here now?
The space bar on the laptop or the right button?
Income from nature, turning challenges into opportunities, we all win. As a kid, I grew up in these forests. And in Guyana, where I am from, 80% of the forest cover is intact. And we have survived. We've had our medicines, we've had our food, we've had our recreation in this location. We have been able to survive, or we continue to live with the knowledge of using the natural environment, things that are biodegradable. And while I was growing up, I wondered what life was like, what it was, what happens. Because I saw a number of old people, my granny, my father, and there was this quest for understanding more. And my grandmother said, life is like a game, or it is a game. That if we know our partners, and if we know what to do, all of us win. Meaning, man and nature. Meaning, the partners being the various life forms that manages the ecosystem. And that is what is important, knowing your partner so that we could win. What we do, what I do, what man do, what the worm does, what the fish does, what the jaguar does, what the tree does. So it is about understanding what this life is all about so that we could have a healthy ecosystem. So the wisdom was taught. And in the forest, you have to be respectful, because the elders would say, we are the ones that are intruding upon the life of others. We have to be very careful. We have to be respectful so that we could all have a place and respect for Mother Earth. The situation is that I know a number of scientists or a number of persons would say, they would call this slash and burn. putting a really barbaric sort of thinking, slash and burn, like you're going to chop and kill. But we prefer to call it rotational farming, because this is very serious in the lives of indigenous peoples. While we do that, we allow Mother Earth to be given the opportunity to allow new trees to grow, new plants to grow. And when this is being used after 3-4 years, we leave it, we move to another spot, and then you see new trees, mainly medicinal trees coming. Further to that, when there are plants, fruits, vegetables, you have animals and birds also using the very spot. We've been thinking about this for many years. I've seen the progression from our way of life to the incoming of development. We cannot stop development. We realize that. We've seen challenges such as logging starting, mining. And these are challenges that we go through, we face. But again, we deal with a nation, and we look for economic growth. But then it could be disastrous if we do not know what to do. And here we look at the opportunities instead of the negatives. What has happened? Our people have decided that nothing for us without us. We need to take a position. We also cannot live alone. It is about finding the balance. And our way of operation, we have 9 indigenous groups across Guyana, speaking different languages, and practices are different. So my group is the Makushi group. I would not use, let us say, like the monkeys, but I have my neighbor who would be using that. So in a way, we are conserving that species here for our friends over there. Or I might not be eating frogs, but we have another group that eat frog. So, and they're plentiful in our area. So we're conserving that, and when they get plentiful, they go. And all around the country, it is the same. Some people do not eat paka or wild meat, but they will eat deer. So that we eat a lot of paka and deer and wild hog. So those things are kept there, and it is a way of conservation, and our way of doing things are a little different. So we do not focus on one area, say like logging or mining alone. We do it a little bit of everything, so it continues to survive. The nature continues to survive. So our people, we've learned that in development, which must happen, we need to be part of it, part and parcel of the decision making. First, the idea, the discussion, the planning, implementation, and looking for the sustainability. And we have been partnering with a number of NGOs, and I'm happy that CI has made a presentation. We have been collaborating with CI, WWF, Ewakrama, other conservation groups. like-minded people, looking for a balance, looking for that way of working and living together. For the way forward, our people says, when the stomach is filled, we think about the other things, or we could think about the other things. If the stomach is empty, we think about filling it, and we could get into trouble for that. So, in this development, we have been focusing on agriculture, food security, healthy eating, and all of this is part of a movement at this time in our history. So we have these young persons here working with other young foreigners who come to visit. We have had a number of capacity building, and we have found that we have a lot of hard-working people. As a matter of fact, we have always been. But we have also found a lot of followers. What is missing are leaders. So what we're doing here, we are training young leaders who could be able to represent, who could be able to defend, who could be able to stand up for the love of nature, for what nature should be, and to defend our community, of course, with the understanding of the partnership. We have also been using for years in bartering, we used to trade, just take things, we exchange. But today we have seen jewels from the forest, like beads. We have the young people, as you're seeing here, getting into the jewel business, into things from the plants, say the crabwood oil, the Ite palm. They have their scientific name, but I don't know. I'm telling you from the common side of things. And these things are biodegradable. You can go to the forest year after year and have a living off of this. This includes bird watching, and 95% of the time our guides take birders into the location. They see the hot birds. They're really hot birds, the special birds there, and it's getting bigger. Tourism is something new for us, but it is using the forest to be earning a dollar. And what happens in the community is we rotate workers. We do not work full out like the normal government workers until you meet 65, then you go on leave. You work 2 weeks, 2 months on, or 1 month, depending on your availability. So you have freedom and a love of life to interact, to live life as it should. This is one example of what the tourism activity is all about. And this community actually is my community. I'm not boasting about it, but I just wanted to promote it. And anytime you feel like, just get in touch with us. I'll leave my contact. And here is where we have had a number of persons coming. And the people themselves are managing this. I used to be there. I'm no longer there. One beautiful thing that happened to us, in 1992, we changed the sort of authority, partnership. Women used to be looked upon as, what you call it, tender things for home. But we had to change that because we hadn't enough men. And of course, men will only think men's story. So we had to get the women on board. And today I am so happy to see that the majority of administrators in my community and other communities are women. We have other areas like fishing, sightseeing. These are just some of them. This here is the largest waterfall in the world. This is the Kaichor Fall. One drop, it's 700 feet. One drop, and then it goes for another 22 feet. So this is one of our landmarks. In addition to that, we have the giants. We call them the giants of El Dorado. The jaguars, the black caiman, the anaconda, the giant anteater, the arapaima, the largest sweetwater fish, tapir, and many other things that would attract you to the beautiful country of Guyana. We also speak, well, we try to speak English, so you could, I hope you're understanding me. So we are at this time at the point of, well, we have found oil, a great discovery in great abundance. The fear is, if we do not prepare now, it could be disaster. So our young people, we are getting them organized so that we do not forget agriculture. We do not forget the other activities. And we would work in partnership. We would look at other events that caused destruction and try to avoid it. And not to get swell-headed, but to work together in partnership with others who know, so that nature and all of us, what I would say, we all win. Thank you very much. This is some things from the things to give.
Thank you, Sydney.
To give you.
Oh. We have time for questions if anyone wants to ask anything.
This is some of the.
Thank you so much. I'll share it with the organizers.
This is some of the products from the forest.
Thank you. So, go ahead.
Hi.
Any of the panel.
So I was just wondering, when dealing with ecotourism and trying to maintain the ecology of a certain place, how do you deal with like predators and still maintaining the predators in the system while having humans wanting to go in that same area?
So, was anyone in particular you directing that to?
Anyone who has like ecotourism.
Okay, generally, animals are afraid of human beings. What we do is, when you live in a forest or in an environment, you tend to get a clear feeling of what is there and what could happen. So you begin to understand animals, and when the animals get, like, let us say a jaguar, for example, when it gets old and is cornered, then it will attack. But if it is young, you have to attack it before it will, or you have to corner it before it could attack you. Or with regards to the snakes and so, well, that's a different story.
Other question? Yes.
So my question is for Felipe, but I believe many of you could provide some valuable insight too. From Panama myself, ¿qué tal, vecino? And when trying to get any degree of environmental impact, one of the factors that hinder such initiative the most tends to be the cultural one, and that's both in terms of the population and the political culture. And I was just wondering, since Costa Rica seems to be like an exceptional scenario of a success story in the region, what sort of cultural transition or how does this path look like for other developing countries? especially in Latin America?
Yes, I understand your question, and I think it's a very good one. And actually, I worked between Costa Rica and Panama and La Amistad, in 2002 to 2007. And therefore, I was very much in contact with conservation movement in Panama. And I was very surprised of how similar things that were happening in Panama at that time were to what was happening in Costa Rica in the early 90s. So there's like a learning curve of the process. In the early 90s in Costa Rica, there were organizations like AECO, the series of activism, very strong activism that was bringing in a very harsh voice against the abuse in the way resources were being managed. When I was working in Panama, I could start to feel that. When the reports that were coming out on the newspapers, there was much of that. But that didn't happen in Costa Rica longer, because the Costa Rica model had evolved, and it was about how do you implement the conservation. Now Costa Rica has to evolve into understanding that conservation, from conservation biology theory, it's protection and sustainable use. We as a country have gone a lot towards conservation. There's a lot of voids still. There are many things that need to be secured. The representativity in terms of realms. For example, in the marine area, there's no agenda of conservation. We're starting to put it forward. But this brings to the other question. Now we have a problem with alligators. And we've had cases of alligators attacking tourists. So we have to do wildlife management. There's a balance in the system. We're just evolving, and we have to have a system that evolves over time in a good condition. So I think that what you have in Costa Rica is not a cookie-cutter scheme. What you have is a country as ahead of the curve because of many other conditions, the peace dividend, et cetera, that has been forced to address these issues and learn from it. So that's why we can share good and bad lessons. If we're going to go and our knowledge could be of use for Cambodia, and because they have an issue regarding, deforestation, well, we better apply knowledge and experiences of Costa Rica, but entangle with adaptation knowledge that probably was not developed in Costa Rica, because new things come about. So I think every country has to find its own unique scheme of how to evolve and how to address issues. But there's certain elements that come in certain moments on that learning curve. And that's what I was very content when I saw Panamanian experience. I haven't been there in a while, but that it was moving in a good direction in fulfilling those milestones that need to be achieved in the development of a conservation agenda.
Thank you, Felipe. Other questions, comments? Yes.
Thank you all. That was really wonderful and inspiring. Question for James. You, in your presentation on the healing properties of plants, in the United States, the healthcare industry and the pharmaceutical industry is a huge sector of our economy. We've heard a lot at this conference about people forming coalitions and working together. Is there anything being done to galvanize that community and the power and political and economic clout it has to help conserve plants and habitat both in the United States and around the world in places like the tropical forests where those plants are so abundant?
Well, the unfortunate answer to that is probably no. In fact, there is very little interest in natural products in the corporate pharmaceutical world these days. For a 20-year period, the National Institutes of Health financed a group called the International Cooperative Biodiversity Groups, which did have that. They were partnerships between conservation organizations, research organizations, and commercial pharmaceutical companies. I was lucky to participate in one that had Conservation International as a partner. And we had, over the years, we had different corporate pharmaceutical partners. But natural products is not a very active endeavor in most corporate research programs.
Thank you, Jim. And I'm going to call that the last question. But before we all bolt, I'll just tell you, first round's on me at the bar. But also, before we bolt, I do want to have him stand and be acknowledged that this whole weekend wouldn't have happened, the Earth Optimism Summit, if, among others, Steve Montfort, the director of the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute in Front Royal, Virginia, hadn't been championing and pushing very hard. So, Steve, please take your feet and accept our appreciation. So thank you, and of course, thanks to all of the great speakers and presentations, and let's head on out.